Hello, this is Daryl Ehrlich, and this is the Vietnam Voices series, a project of the Billings Gazette and sponsored by Masterlube. Today is February 5th, 2016, and I am honored today to be joined by Dr. David Roberts. He's got an amazing story. I know some of his story already, but I'm excited to hear the rest of it. And Dr. Roberts, we've interviewed more than 70 veterans to this point, and he's got a story that really is quite unique among the ones we've heard from. I want to thank him for being with me today. Thank you, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. So let's start at the beginning, which is about the only place I know where to start, which is 1965. Let's talk about life before the Air Force and what were you doing and where were you at?
Well, I grew up in the country.
Okay.
At least part of my life was in the country, and did a lot of stupid and fun things that kids growing up in the country do.
Yeah.
Pulled a lot of pranks. Ended up moving to Louisville, Kentucky, and that's where I went to high school.
Okay.
And in high school, probably my main interest was ROTC. And my one desire was to be an infantry officer, and I wanted to go to West Point. And thought that was nailed down because my parents happened to be good friends with then Senator Albert Gore, not the one that became the vice president.
His father.
His father. And I even remember the Gores coming to visit. And in thinking back, one day it dawned on me, I didn't see the kid that became vice president. And I wondered why until I started looking at dates and I realized he wasn't born yet. But I was expecting to get a nomination to West Point from Senator Gore. And then in high school, my senior year, they had a college and careers day. And I went to that, and they had some people there representing the services. And I found out that I couldn't go to West Point because I wore glasses. And they were getting ready to have a basketball tournament, and I walked over to the gymnasium, went up in the back, and I was standing there, and one of the ROTC instructors came up to me and said, well, how did it go, and what did you find out? And I said, I can't go to West Point. And he said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I guess I'll get an engineering degree and try to go into the service that way. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, no, you need to go to medical school. You'd make a good doctor, and walked off. Now, what he never knew was that he totally changed my life with that one little encouraging statement. And from that moment on, I knew I wanted to go to medical school. I also knew I wanted to go into the service. And my senior year in medical school, I signed up with the Air Force and was commissioned. Then interned in the Air Force. And war in Vietnam broke out with the Gulf of Tonkin incident just about halfway through my internship. And from there I went to MacDill Air Force Base, and it was after I'd been there about a year, I started getting offers for reassignment. And the first one was to go do a residency at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital. And I was having too much fun in Tampa, going to the beach, fishing. So I turned that down. And then they called and offered me an opportunity to go to Thailand. Well, I still liked fishing, so I turned that down. What I didn't realize is once you get an offer, you are going to go somewhere.
Right. It was the option to stay was not the option.
Yes. And about a week or two later, I got a call not offering me, but telling me that I would be assigned to the 552nd Medical Service flight in Vietnam, and that I would be living in a small Army Special Forces camp. The person that called me, his wife was a patient of mine, and I had just delivered her baby. And he must have thought that going to a Special Forces camp was a death sentence, because he was just really upset when he called me. But that's how I happened to find my way to Vietnam. And we were part of what was called MILFAP team, a Military Public Health Assistance Program team. There were 40 provinces in Vietnam, and they wanted to put a team in each of those provinces. So they sent 7 Army, 7 Air Force, and 6 Navy teams, and if you add that up, that's 20. And then the other teams came from other countries, Korea, Spain, Turkey, Australia, just a lot of different countries had teams over there. And the teams were generally 14 people with 3 doctors. And our task was to provide health care to the civilians. And where I was assigned was at Camp David Witter. And David Witter was actually the first Special Forces member to be killed in Vietnam. And so they named that camp after him. It was a B-team camp, and the total makeup of the camp would vary from about 25 to 30 people. With our team, the Special Forces team, and then there were usually some Air Force pilots that would be there, 1 or 2 that served as forward air controllers. And since it was a small camp, everybody had to pitch in, and that was probably the only place in the world and the only time in history where Air Force doctors pulled guard duty at an Army Special Forces camp.
So I want to do a little backing up in housekeeping with this story. So you did at that moment, had you, before the ROTC recruiter said you should be a doctor, had you ever considered it? Had you ever considered medicine?
No, not at all.
But that stuck in your head as a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
When he said that, and I've said many times, you need to give an encouraging word once in a while to a young person. You never have any idea the effect that can have. That ROTC instructor moved away. This happened in December, right before Christmas, and he moved away, I guess, in January. I never saw him again, and he never knew the influence that he had on my life.
And you did medical school where?
The University of Louisville.
Okay. And then you thought, well, when you were called, when you were given the opportunity or told the opportunity that was awaiting for you in Vietnam, had you ever considered that you might be sent to a place like Vietnam or a war zone? Because this is 1965. This is the year that we committed combat troops. Things were happening in Vietnam, but it wasn't front and center as it would be a few years after, in say 68 or 69.
I never expected that. In fact, when I was in medical school, we took a parasitology course. And the professor that taught that kept saying that we needed to learn all of that because we never knew but what we might end up someday in Southeast Asia. And I remember laughing and thinking, who in the world in their right mind would ever go to Southeast Asia, and why would you ever want to know any of this? Well, when I landed at the little airstrip there at the town of Han Quan, where the Special Forces camp was located, I was met by Dr. Gleason, who was member of the first team to get there. Ours was the second team, and we served. Actually, I was his replacement, and he told me as I got off the plane that after 2 weeks I could rewrite any textbook on tropical medicine that had ever been written, and he was right.
So let's. What was your first impression of Vietnam?
There's just a multitude of impressions.
Okay, what were some of them?
Well, when we first got there, they put us up in a little building right next to the runway there at Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, and very busy place, and sleeping was pretty much impossible because there were jets going down the runway full blast about every 2 to 3 minutes.
Right.
The second day, they sent me and a couple other people to what was called the MAC-V headquarters training building. That was an old hotel in downtown Saigon. I was up on the 3rd floor. The water pressure was such that wide open, the faucet would drip.
Wow.
And I learned how to take a bath with a cup full of water. In the area around there were people's residences, and found out that the culture was just very different from anything I'd ever seen. About the 2nd or 3rd day of my 5 days there, there was a wedding across the street, and everyone was dressed up in their finest. The amazing thing was that children were dressed up in their finest, but toddlers had pants that had about a 4-inch wide band cut out of them so that they were open from the buttocks around to the front, so that children could go to the bathroom anywhere they wanted to.
Wow.
And that was pretty much the case
Right.
throughout that country. So I never saw a case of diaper rash because no one ever had a diaper on.
So it was kind of a shock, right? I mean, here you'd had all this training, and the conditions in America were probably a little more sanitary.
Yeah, a little bit. And then I was flown out to where I was going to spend my year. That day, as soon as Dr. Gleason arrived, he drove me around to show me everything that he could think of that I might want to see. And the first thing we did was we rode up and around the camp, and there was a big 8-inch howitzer set up right next to the camp. He pointed that out, and then we went over to the hospital. There I saw that it was about probably 30-bed hospital. There were usually 4 to 5 patients in a bed, and the family would be bedded down around the bed and under the bed. Most of those patients were patients that had malaria. The children were severely malnourished, actually malnourished due to parasites that they had, the most common ones being ascaris and hookworm, and then they all had malaria. And so these were very sick children, and there were a number of deaths every day, I was told. When we went by and looked at the clinic, there was no electricity in the little clinic building. And then we rode over to a golf course about 3-4 miles away, a French-owned golf course, very pretty place. And there was a swimming pool. And as we got out of the Jeep, I heard a tinkling of a bell and looked around. and here came some very pretty young Vietnamese lady wearing an ao dai, which is a long sort of dress that is split on the side, and they have slacks under that. But it's a very pretty outfit. Mm-hmm. And she was riding a three-wheel bicycle, I guess tricycle, and in the front there was a big box that had ice and Cokes. And so out in the middle of nowhere, I was able to purchase a Coke, and was pretty much amazed. Probably less than 2 weeks after that, 1st Infantry Division sent in a brigade, and with bulldozers they flattened the area, converting a golf course to a runway surrounded by mud. And I went over there fairly frequently, and all of the troops' living conditions were worse than you can imagine. They each dug a hole about the size of a grave, and down in the bottom of the hole they put I can't think of the term right now. The things that you stack stuff on so that they can put forklifts under them.
Oh, pallets?
Yeah, they put wood pallets so that they wouldn't be standing in water, and then had a little half shelter cover over that for a roof, and that's where they lived. During the rainy season, that location, which was called Quan Loy, was pretty much 3-4 inches deep in mud. And that was home to those guys for a year. But they were an amazing group of people.
Yeah.
In my book, which is entitled "Lord, I'm Not Dead Yet," I describe all the ways that people from the 1st Infantry Division helped us. We worked at a little hospital, as I said.
Yep. Let's talk. I want to back up a little about that, because this is not. You're trained even in 1965 in fairly advanced conditions. Here's a place that doesn't have. It may have running water, but it doesn't have electricity. How are you supposed to practice medicine without? Well, it's not particularly sanitary. You might have water, but you don't have electricity. With all due respect, how the heck are you going to practice medicine in a place like that?
Well, you do what you have to do. The hospital would get electricity maybe 1 or 2 hours at night. So, and in the wards there would be one bulb. In an area that we later used as an operating room, there was a light bulb there.
And tell me, remind me how that was. There's a great story in your book about how you first powered a light in your operating room. Will you tell me about that?
Yeah, I'll get to it.
Okay.
There was no running water. And, in the operating room, you scrub. You not only scrub down the patient so that you're operating in a clean area, but the surgical team scrubs. They scrub their hands and their arms, and you wear caps and masks and gowns and gloves. When I first got there, we had gloves.
Okay.
We didn't have any water to scrub with. And we had a few masks. And I've got some pictures in here of us operating. There was no operating room light. Military supply sergeants are the most amazing people in the world. They all know that there are 3 words that count. It's mission, mission, and mission. And if you don't have something, if there's another unit around, their supply sergeant will try to make sure that you get it, even if maybe quasi-legal in the way things were transferred around.
Right.
But the supply sergeant came up with a Jeep headlight, and somebody nailed together some 2x4s, made a stand, hooked the Jeep headlight on it, ran jumper cables outside the operating room to the Jeep, and that was our operating room light. The operating room had a screen door in the front and in back without any way of latching it. And after we started doing surgery, and you've got to realize the first team that got there had it a lot worse than we had it. They had absolutely nothing to work with, and they had begun to get the hospital functioning in their year there, and they left. And then we were able to take it a lot further. But that operating room, once we got started with that, was the center of attraction for the community. And all the kids would come, and some of them would come on through the door and gather around the operating table to watch us operate. One day a cow stuck her head in, and that's when I decided we had to do something about that. And I said something to our supply sergeant. Well, within 24 hours, people from the 1st Infantry Division arrived on the scene with fence posts, post hole diggers, and barbed wire and staples. Our staff didn't have to put the fence up. There was a prison or a jail nearby, and the prisoners all vied to see who could come help at the hospital, because they knew that if they came, first of all, they'd have a day away from the jail, and secondly, we'd make sure that they got snacks and good food, and if they wanted them, somebody would supply them with cigarettes. And so there was always people wanting to come help. So almost by magic, the post holes were dug and the posts were put in place, and I looked out and saw the prisoners trying to stretch barbed wire by hand. So I went out and showed them how you can take 2 claw hammers and stretch barbed wire.
Something you learned on the farm?
Oh, yeah. Growing up on the farm, that's what I did all the time.
Right.
You could just wedge the claw hammer against the post and push on it with your leg, and then take the other one and drive staples in. And so I showed them how to do that. Well, one of the nurses, Vietnamese nurses, was really upset. And they came running she and another one came running out to me saying, "Boxy Robert," which meant Dr. Roberts, "you cannot do that. You're a doctor. You work with your mind. You cannot work with your hands." Well, that was the first I knew of that. Certainly my dad didn't know that.
Right, exactly.
And so we were able to fence off the place. Some of the things that came out of that are almost amazing beyond belief. One of them is a story that I've told many, many times teaching students at Rocky PA School and teaching medical students, interns, and residents before I came up here. Is a story of Dr. Jones, and I've got a chapter in the book about Dr. Jones. Well, Dr. Jones, when he arrived, went down to the clinic his first morning. About 10 o'clock in the morning, one of our corpsmen came to me and asked me if I could come help out at the clinic. And I said, okay, are y'all really busy? And he said, well, we're pretty busy, but Dr. Jones left. And I said, he left? And the corpsman said, yes, he said he was never doing that again. Well, Dr. Jones did leave, and he went back to our camp. And for the next couple of weeks, you never saw him in uniform. All he wore was striped shirt and plaid shorts, or vice versa. And he just laid in bed. And he only got up to go to the latrine or to come eat. Although he did pull guard duty. He'd put on his uniform if it was time to pull his turn at guard duty. And, people began to be concerned about Dr. Jones.
Right.
And then after about 2 weeks, he had a little portable typewriter, and he'd sit at that typewriter from early in the morning until probably 10 or 11 o'clock at night typing. And this went on for a while. And then I was in the clinic, and one of the nurses came to me and said, we just saw Dr. Jones. And he went in the Minister of Health's office there. And there was a local lower-level Minister of Health. And pretty soon I saw Dr. Jones come walking out with a folder in his hand and in uniform, and he and this minister were bowing to each other. And he got in a Jeep and he drove over to the province chief's office. And then from there he went to the Special Forces camp commander's office. Well, I found out what was going on with Dr. Jones. When he got there, after a few hours in the clinic, he was so upset because he saw people that were probably going to die. And rather than just trying to treat all of them, he knew that most of those illnesses were totally preventable. And I'm sure that affected him more than any of us can imagine. And so he laid in bed thinking, and he put together this plan. And what he knew was that the mosquitoes that carried malaria would dwell on the ceilings of buildings during the day and fly down at night to bite. And that's not true everywhere in the world, but in that area, that was the ones that carried the malaria. And he knew that you could do something about that. He also knew that all these people, many adults, but certainly all the children, were suffering from parasites, worms. And during the couple of weeks that he was laying around, we got called to some villages because there'd been a cholera outbreak. By the time we'd get to those villages, everybody that caught cholera was dead, and the other half of the village didn't catch it, and they were alive. But by the time someone came and told us about it, and by the time we could get a helicopter and fly over to those villages, there was nothing that we could do for anybody. Well, what he realized was that the worms that these children were getting were because the children and adults defecated on the ground, and the eggs that were there would hatch, and then the larvae would burrow up through the skin of their bare feet, and the children in particular would have severe problems with hookworm ascaris, and ascarids can be as big as a pencil, and you'd see those coughed up. And he knew that if you could just give people clean water, then the cholera epidemics would go away. The typhoid would go away if you could give them latrines and get them to use it, that there would be no more problems with the worms. And if you could spray DDT on the ceilings of the houses and buildings, that the problems with malaria would almost completely go away. So he worked out this public health program, and then we would go into these villages for what was called a med camp, and we'd have units from the 1st Infantry Division or Special Forces or someone to provide security for us. We'd go in and pass out rice, go in with a load of 50-pound bags of rice for the people. We'd set up a bathing station, bathe all the kids. Our team members and many of the special forces had begun writing home, and wives were speaking to people in their churches, and we were getting boxes and boxes of clothing for the children and adults. So we would also pass out clothing. We'd set up a line, and people could come through, and they could be immunized for typhoid and cholera, and then we would treat whatever illnesses they had that we could treat. We'd usually set up a dental station, which was the back seat of a Jeep, and extract really bad teeth for people. A year after we first got there, well, specifically a year after Dr. Jones got there, we were in the same time of the year that was the big malaria season. By that time, we'd gone from 4 and 5 patients in a bed and people dying right and left to 1 patient per bed and empty beds because people weren't getting malaria. We weren't seeing the severely malnourished children anymore. And thousands of lives were saved, I'm sure, because of the work that Dr. Jones did.
Did you think he had kind of gone around the bend and he had lost it?
Yeah. And
did anybody ask him, or do you just leave a guy like that alone? What do you do with a guy like that?
Well, the Special Forces officers started coming to me and saying, "What are you going to do with Dr. Jones?" And I know what they were thinking was that we needed to put him on a helicopter and send him back to Saigon, and maybe he needed to be court-martialed or something.
Right.
Well, it ended up that our unit won the Outstanding Air Force Medal, Air Force Unit Medal, and we won it not because of the care that Dr. Gartland and I gave to all the patients, but because of the public health program that Dr. Jones put together.
Yeah.
And then after that, one day he said something to the mess sergeant, who was one of the members of the Special Forces team, and the sergeant took offense and said, "Well, if you can do it so much better, you can have it." And he walked out. And so Captain Jerry Jones, United States Air Force, MD, took over the mess hall, and we had the best meals that were served anywhere in the whole country. One day a week we'd have gourmet meals. Sometimes we'd have things like flaming grape Suzettes.
Wow.
And all because of this Dr. Jones, who everybody thought had lost it.
So let me ask you about when you got your orders to go to Vietnam, were you worried?
I really wasn't. Other people worried, but my dream had been to be an infantry officer.
So you were close by.
And to be stationed at an Army Special Forces camp actually was sort of fulfilling a dream. And you know, there are risks in everything you do. And this doesn't have anything to do with my time in Vietnam, but in my lifetime, I have known 7 people who've been murdered. Now, I've lived in nice neighborhoods and had nice friends, but this has happened. And, you know, so where are you safe? And so I looked forward to my time in Vietnam. There were moments where I guess it was some risk associated with it.
Did you when you were over there, did you find it frustrating to practice medicine in a place that was so primitive compared to training? I'm guessing your training was not that primitive. At least cows. I've been to Louisville. I didn't think cows were in the operating rooms.
No, cows never made it to the operating room at Louisville General Hospital. Well, it's sort of an amazing thing. In a situation like that, you use what you have and you do what you can. For instance, we had patients who needed chest tubes put in, but we didn't have any chest tubes. And if someone came in with a pneumothorax, meaning a lung was collapsed and you had to put a tube in to draw out that air and to allow that lung to heal. And so the sergeant that ran our central supply said, "Oh, there's really no difference between a chest tube and a rectal tube." And so he sterilized rectal tubes, and that's what we put in people's chests.
And it worked.
And it worked. There was no such thing as nasogastric suction machines like they have in hospitals. But one of the corpsmen knew how to set up bottles of water and to create a vacuum with water flowing from one bottle to another, and that provided suction. We didn't have running water, but UNICEF every now and then would send a big box full of supplies, and one day we got almost a warehouse full of German-made volume expander. Now, there's something called Dextran, but it's an IV fluid that you can use to expand somebody's blood volume in a hurry while you're waiting on blood to transfuse them. Well, we didn't have any blood to transfuse anybody with, but we had lots of Dextran, and so that became our water that we used to scrub patients before surgery and to scrub, for us to do a surgical scrub of our hands and arms before surgery.
Let's talk about. There's another great part of your book. How did you? I'm going to ask a question that I know the answer to, but I'm giving you it's batting practice here. Okay, so you did surgery. You don't have electricity. How'd you have anesthesia?
Well, when we first got there, we found a few vials of what was made up for spinal anesthetic. And so we started doing some cases with spinal anesthesia. And then one day in one of these UNICEF boxes, we got this wooden box that was an anesthesia machine that was made for the British commandos. And it could be airdropped, and it was an ether machine. Now, in the States, no one uses ether anymore because people would get nauseated and really sick after surgery. And it was because when they used ether in the earlier days in this country, they didn't have any way of controlling the level of the anesthetic. Well, with this ether machine, we could control that. Now, ether is also not used in the United States and in most developed countries because they use electrocautery, and ether burns. And ether gas could possibly be explosive, but we didn't have electrocautery, so we didn't have to worry about that. And I had spent a little over a year in medical school working at nights in the anesthesia department, so I'd given hundreds of general anesthetics, and so we started using that.
Now, had you ever used ether before, or how did you learn how to use ether if you hadn't been exposed to it?
Actually, just to teach us, we had used ether drop by mask in laboratory on laboratory animals, and so I had some experience with an ether anesthetic. Okay. And with this machine, it was easy to control. So I began teaching our medical corpsmen, and later on, our nurse midwives, how to use the machine. And when we got there had not been a doctor at that hospital for 15 years before the first of our teams arrived. And they did have nurse midwives. Well, we knew that we weren't going to be there forever, and that after we pulled out, then there would be no way that patients who needed emergency cesarean sections for complicated obstetrical deliveries, there would be no way that they could have their surgery done unless, and they had two Vietnamese nurse midwives who were really bright, very, very capable, and so I taught one of them how to give anesthesia with the machine, and the other one how to do cesarean sections. And so for a good part of the year, anytime there was a cesarean section, all I did was assist, and I had her do all the cases, so that when the day came that the Americans pulled up and left, if there was no doctor, there would at least be
someone who could handle it.
Someone who could handle the problems.
Now, your background is in obstetrics and gynecology, correct? You're trained that, but I'm guessing you did a lot more than, obviously, you're doing anesthesiology. You didn't just stick to obstetrics and gynecology. It sounded like you had to rely more on the general part of the MD training than the specialty part. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yes. Actually, I had spent some time in OB, but I had not done my residency training in obstetrics and gynecology when I went over there. So I was more of what you would call a general medical officer. And in a situation such as where we were, that meant that you took care of the skin and everything inside of it.
So what was the most common thing? Was it malaria and parasites that you most commonly saw? Was that or what's an average day like for a guy like you over in Vietnam?
An average day there was seeing some patients in the clinic. We would have two medical corpsmen sitting at a desk with an interpreter. We would usually have a student, and we had rural health care workers that, rural health care worker students that would be certified after 2 years of working with us, and then would be sent out into these small villages and paid by the government. So there would be 3 tables set up, and those people would see patients, treat the various illnesses that came through, and many of them were patients that had parasites and malaria, and then of course everything else that happens to people can happen.
Right.
And you would see some things that you would never, ever see in the States.
Can you give me an example?
Well, one night I got a call to come down to the hospital. There was a flatbed truck that had pulled in with 2 Vietnamese soldiers. And I got there, and it looked like they had tetanus. Their muscles were all contracted. They were in obvious pain. And with an interpreter, found out that one of them was saying he could not see. Well, you know, the question is, what kind of an illness can cause you to have muscle spasms and blindness and severe pain? And the only thing I could think of was that he had gotten, or the 2 of them had gotten hold of wood alcohol. And the treatment then was to give them intravenous fluids and sodium bicarb to take care of the acidosis that they had. And about the time we started fluids on those 2 patients, then 2 more trucks came in with about 10 or 12 of them, all with the same thing. Well, the story was that this was a unit that guarded a bridge, and a bus driver had come by about the time that one of the guards saw and shot a small deer. And they told the bus driver that he was to pick them up some wine, and the wine that they drank was a rice wine, which I've never tried to drink rubbing alcohol, but I can't imagine that it tastes any worse than their rice wine did. But that he had to bring them back a big bottle of rice wine or they'd kill him when he came back through. Well, he picked them up wood
alcohol
and brought that back to them. And isopropyl alcohol is toxic. And so they had all gotten severely ill from drinking that. That's probably not the sort of problem you're going to see in the States.
Did they survive?
They did.
That's a heck of a thing to have to think about, too. What causes these symptoms? I mean, you're kind of having to sleuth this one out. That must have been, if you like that kind of challenge, it probably was fairly interesting work.
Well, it was, and you know, it's really rewarding to be able to think back into your biochemistry. And by the way, I didn't like biochemistry, but
right.
To think back into that and figure out what had happened to this person, and of course it became more and more obvious as they kept bringing in more and more people with the same problem, and then we finally got the full story of.
Right, what exactly had happened. Yeah. Well, now I want to talk a little bit about what is the did you have the proper medicine for things like the parasites and the malaria? Were you able to treat them and save them when they at least came to you and presented with those symptoms?
When we first got there, the only antibiotic we had was bicillin. And bicillin is really useful only for treating strep throat and syphilis.
Okay.
It's worthless for almost anything else. It's a long-acting penicillin. We did have quinine, which is fortunate because the type of malaria that we had was falciparum malaria, which is the most deadly malaria you can get. That's something that can cause you to die in a hurry. And the falciparum malaria was resistant to the drugs chloroquine and primaquine, but could be treated with quinine. So we could get quinine, and we could get some of the medications for parasites. Now our supply route we were under the control of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, called ARVN, and that was where we were supposed to get all of our supplies, and we almost never got anything. You could turn in requisitions and they'd take them, and then nothing would ever come of it. So as I said, supply sergeants around the world take care of their buddies.
Right.
And so we had a sergeant who was to be our supply sergeant, and after we'd been there a week or two, he came to me and he said, Doc, I want us to start a PX, a post-exchange. Now, that's the term in the Army and the Air Force. It's a base exchange. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I said, well, why in the world do you want to do that? He said, well, what you don't know is that in a combat zone, there's a 10% breakage rate on durable items, and about a 20% breakage rate allowed on liquor. And he said, we have a lot of people from 1st Infantry Division that come by here and other units that come by here, and so we can sell a good many cameras. And he said, we can sell a good bit of liquor. And he said, and we can handle the liquor for our camp's club. And he said, with a 20% breakage rate allowance, he said, then that gives us a lot of bottles of Chivas Regal and a number of Nikon cameras that we can claim as being combat losses. And he said, you can take a broken, in quotes,
right,
Nikon camera and a broken case of Chivas Regal and go to any Air Force base in Vietnam and get all the supplies you want. And so what we did was we'd get some Montagnard crossbows, maybe even a VC flag, and pack up some Chivas Regal and a camera or two, and fly off to visit one of the supply sergeants in Cam Ranh Bay or Tan Son Nhut or Bien Hoa or any of the big bases, and we'd send somebody every 2 weeks to go, and they would come back with an airplane full of supplies. I know I went to Cam Ranh Bay, and Cam Ranh Bay was the home base for the 15th Tactical Fighter Wing. Well, when I was stationed in Vietnam, they had before I was stationed in Vietnam, I was in Tampa, Florida at MacDill Air Force Base, and that was, at that time, the home of the 15th and the 16th Tactical Fighter Wing. And our supply sergeant, along with a number of other people, got moved with the 15th Tactical Fighter Wing to set up Cam Ranh Bay. And I knew the supply sergeant, so I went to see him, and we spent a few hours talking, and then I spent a couple of days going out and laying on the beach there at Cam Ranh Bay. And then when I decided I was ready to go back to work, I went and saw him. He said, well, give me a couple of hours, And then he sent me out, and there was a big C-130, which is a very large airplane that was packed solid with medical supplies. We landed at Tan Son Nhut and transferred everything into Caribou aircraft, which are smaller cargo twin-engine airplanes, and flew back and landed and had more in the way of supplies than you can even begin to imagine. But, you know, all of these sergeants and all of these units do everything they can to make sure that that other military units have what they need to carry out their mission.
Yeah. That's a beautiful story. I want now my favorite in your book, and you have to tell this because it's of the things you have to acquire. Toward the end, you acquired an X-ray machine.
Yeah.
I need to know how. Will you set that story up for me, because you don't think of it, but how do you go about it when you need an X-ray machine? This is how crafty these guys were. You could acquire an X-ray machine, not just a Nikon camera or a nice bottle of scotch, but an X-ray machine, Dr. Roberts.
Well, the unit that was there, the 552nd Medical Service flight that was there for a year before we came in as their replacements, had requisitioned through Army of Vietnam Medical Supply Depot an X-ray machine and a generator. And every time we would go into Saigon to switch flights and go to some Air Force base and really get our supplies, we'd make sure that we stopped by the medical depot there and complain. and there never was an X-ray machine. Well, Lieutenant John Porter, who was our administrator, said to me one day, said, "Doc, let's go get an X-ray machine." I said, "Okay, how are we going to do that?" He said, "Well, I've been to the depot and I've looked around." So we flew in to Tan Son Nhut, spent the evening in Saigon at a hotel, and the next morning caught a cab back to Tan Son Nhut. We checked out a truck and drove to the medical depot. And John looked at me and he said, "Now, Doc, I want you to go in there and raise sand with them about the fact that we've been requisitioning an X-ray unit for over a year and they haven't gotten us one." And he said, "Just really fuss at them." And he said, "But when you see me, thank them for their efforts and come back out and hop in the truck real fast." So I did what he said. Well, he walked around the depot and he found an X-ray machine, and with a marker like a Sharpie, he wrote on there, "Ben Long Hospital." And then he went and got one of the Vietnamese that worked in the depot and took him back there and showed him and said, "This is our X-ray machine. See, it's got our name on it." And they got a forklift, loaded it on the truck. He came by with the truck, and as soon as I saw it, I said, "Well, thank you," and walked out, jumped in the truck, and we took off, and we had an X-ray machine. We flew back, and
I get the sense that even the plane was warmed up by that time.
Probably. And we landed, and the next day, and I've told you that supply sergeants everywhere know each other, and it's a real fraternity. And the next day, a truck and a bunch of people from the 1st Infantry Division, what's called Big Red 1, arrived at the hospital with a big diesel-powered generator, and we had electricity, and we had an X-ray machine. Now, before that, of course, we needed a building for an X-ray machine. And we normally finished in the clinic at about 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the mail plane, one that would make a trip around all the Special Forces bases, usually got there about 4 o'clock. And so we told Special Forces that we could take care of picking up the mail every day. And one day we saw the caribou circling, and it was obvious it was time that was probably the mail plane. And John Porter jumped in a Jeep and rode down to the airstrip. Well, the caribou landed, and John was standing there in an Air Force uniform and a red beret, looking unlike anything that people in the United States Air Force had ever seen before. And one of the crew looked at him and said, "You must be the Providence refugee rep." And John said, "What?" He said, "Here, sign this." So John was handed a clipboard, he signed it, and they unloaded a bunch of steel beams and metal roofing, and the plane flew off. Well, I heard about a year after I got back to the States that was supposed to be a refugee center building somewhere in Vietnam. And the plane had landed at the wrong airstrip. Well, again, we loaded that up, brought it up, and the next morning, folks from Big Red 1 were there pouring concrete, and a couple of days later putting up the framework for the building. And a few days after that, we had prisoners that were over there making bricks. And I guess in less than 2 weeks' time, we had a building that would serve as a new operating room and X-ray room. And so, you know, if you've got an X-ray room, you need an X-ray machine. And the people at the Arvin Medical Depot were glad to give us one.
Finally came through after a year long.
Yeah.
So tell me, you know, one of the things that you said there, and I think it's important to realize that most of the doctors and the medics that we've talked to might occasionally run across someone from Vietnam or help someone with an ARVN, but most of our medical people that we've talked to as a part of this series basically saw soldiers, Americans. But you were all these 40 medical teams, 20 of them American, were there to kind of, as you told it, win the hearts and the minds of the people. Is that kind of where you were a different type of ambassador? Is that right? Am I getting that right?
You've got it exactly right. President Johnson, in his Texas drawl, which I can't quite.
Oh, you got it close enough for Montana.
I got it close enough. Talked about
the lilt is great.
Winning the hearts and minds of the countrymen.
Right.
Okay, and they came up with the idea of these military public health assistance program teams, 40 provinces in Vietnam and 40 teams. And ours was a team that actually went to the most remote and poorest part of the country. Others actually went where there was a medical facility that was working.
Right. Well, you had I guess you had a facility in name.
Yeah. Being with Special Forces, people who don't know anything about the Special Forces probably don't know that their training program is long, arduous, and difficult. And then people, as they begin to finish their training, are divided up and assigned a special duty, or MOS. And those who become Special Forces medics get a very intense training program there at Fort Bragg. And so at our camp, we had a Special Forces medic. Well, he was extremely capable. There's very little that they cannot take care of. And so he took care of all the military medical personnel, including the members of our team. And our job was to care for Vietnamese civilians, and occasionally, like the incident with the alcohol problem, once in a while we would get some of the ARVN, or Army of Republic of Vietnam troops, but we took care of civilians. Now, sometimes the civilians weren't civilians.
Yeah, I was going to ask how, in Vietnam, it's hard to tell the enemy from the friendlies.
Right. And of course, as medical personnel, we took care of whoever came in. And there was one man that came in that was very sick with malaria, and he made several trips to the clinic, and our corpsman saw him and spoke to him through an interpreter and took care of him. And at the end of his time that he needed to be seen in the clinic, our corpsman and airman, using an interpreter, told him that wouldn't need to see him anymore. Thought he was going to be able to fully recover. And with that, the man spoke up in perfect Oxford English, knowing English far better than I know it, and certainly better than any of our corpsmen knew English, and explained that he was a battalion commander with a VC unit, and that he appreciated the care that he had received, and that he wanted to turn himself in under what was called the Chu Hoi, or Open Arms Program, where they would take people like him, fly them to a camp to get some training, and then put them back in the field, this time fighting with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Mm. And Corpsman came to me and said, "What do I do?" he said, "The guy just handed me his pistol."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, what you do is you call up to the Special Forces camp and get them to send somebody down to pick him up. And an hour or two later, a helicopter arrived to pick him up and take him, I think, into Saigon."
Sure.
So we knew that we took care of the families of a lot of the Viet Cong, the enemy. Mm-hmm. And it's obvious that we took care of some of the enemy troops, too, who would come in.
Does that bother you?
No, I often wondered, and I've never been able to get an answer to the question, what if I'd been captured? Would it have been proper for me to give medical care to the enemy? You know, as a physician, if somebody's sick, you take care of them.
Right, that's your oath, that's your job.
And I asked that question many times of number of military officers, and nobody was ever able to give me an answer. And fortunately, I never had to deal with it.
Were you a target, or were you worried about that? Because on one hand, you're there on a mission of more of a humanitarian mission, but yet you're in a war zone, so it's really hard to maybe drive that point across. So that's a nuanced point when you're in a combat zone.
We were able to get away with doing something that you couldn't do back in the States, and that is wear something as part of our uniform that's not authorized. Dr. Gleason and his unit, when they first got there, realized that they needed to look different than the special forces. And so they came up with the idea of a red beret. And so our unit wore red berets, which were instantly recognizable. And we took care of so many of the families of enemy that we knew that we were safe, except if we hit a landmine. The VC were known to stretch piano wire across the road so that if you were riding down the road with the windshield down on your Jeep, and you had to ride with the doors off and the windshield down so that if there was ever a firefight, you could instantly return fire. And all the Jeeps had a piece of angle iron that was welded to the bumper that went up straight up into the air and then hooked forward, and that was there to break the piano wire if that happened, so that you didn't get your head cut off. So basically, we felt certain that we would not personally be attacked. Now, if there was an attack on the camp, then we could...
Right, then you were more concerned.
But we did a lot of things that must have looked really crazy. One time I went to Camp Tonglachan, and that was a bad camp, but just wandered around.
Right.
And then there was a Camp Minton that I went down there to do a med cap. Well, the local Vietnamese province chief wanted to do some PR, and he wanted us to be part of it. So we had a flatbed truck with speakers on it, playing, in fact, I'd say blaring out Vietnamese music. A couple of Vietnamese girls riding on it, and me and a corpsman riding on the thing. And we were driving around throwing out little pamphlets. And we got to a rubber plantation just as a unit of the 1st Infantry Division arrived. And they pulled up in armored personnel carriers and helicopters dropping people off, and they were digging foxholes and all, and we come riding through the middle of them, me with a red beret, playing music as loud as we could. and I'm sure they looked at us like,
what are you?
What in the world is going on here? They didn't shoot me. So being part of the medical unit was in many ways a strange experience, but we felt like we were generally safe.
Okay. What was it like, some of the soldiers and the veterans have had some interaction, but you probably more than anyone we've talked to had interactions with the Vietnamese people. What were your impressions of the Vietnamese people, working with them, and kind of your experiences?
The Vietnamese women were some of the hardest working people I've ever met in my life. The Vietnamese men really tended not to be. Okay. They let the women do the work. But they really were wonderful people to work with. And I know one day I was talking with one of the nurse midwives who was willing to be frank with me. And most Vietnamese, like most Orientals, make it a point never to hurt your feelings. But Rose, as she was known, didn't mind answering your questions, even if it was kind of blunt. And I asked her one day, I said, what do the people think? I said, this war is going on. Who do they really want to see win? And her answer was, they don't care who wins. They just want it over with. And that was a very truthful answer.
Yeah. What did that? So you're there to win a war. I mean, or at least the military is. How did that strike you at the time?
Well, of course, I wanted us to win the war.
Sure. Yeah.
I was sort of frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a book called Street Without Joy.
Yeah.
And Street Without Joy was written about the occupation by the French and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu when the French were defeated. Now, what happened in Vietnam was that Ho Chi Minh, who became their leader, had actually gone to school in the United States. And the Vietnamese really didn't like the Chinese. Handled properly, Ho Chi Minh and all of Vietnam would have been our ally. But what happened, and was outlined in the book very well, was that in World War II, when the Japanese invaded, Ho Chi Minh led the Vietnamese in combat against the Japanese. Now, Vietnam had been a French colony, and the French had pulled out, and there was no one left to fight except the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. At the end of the war, the French came back and said, we want our colony back.
Right.
And took over. And at that point, a good many of the Vietnamese leaders, Ho Chi Minh being the highest of them, took objection to that. And you ended up with the battles with the French, and eventually the French leaving. And when the French pulled out, then they left behind a government that they had controlled. And we went in behind the French to support that government. And that's how we ended up fighting the North Vietnamese. And every time there was any occasion, we would declare a truce. And I was there at an Army Special Forces camp, and I would go up and fly with some of the Army spotters or with a forward air controller. And during those days of truces, you could fly along and see hundreds, if not thousands, of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong going down the trails bringing supplies. And as you'd fly by them, they'd wave at you because they knew nothing was going to happen. And so we gave them all of these opportunities to resupply. We gave them areas like Cambodia where there were safe havens. And basically it seemed to me like we were doing everything we could to lose the war. Mm-hmm. And I was discouraged when I left and expected that we weren't going to win.
Yeah. What about, what was it like pulling guard duty? You're the first doctor, in fact, first doctor I've heard, or first really officer pulling a guard duty shift as such. Tell me about that.
Well, our camp was located right next to a Vietnamese Special Forces camp. And the Vietnamese Special Forces camp was tasked with providing security. So we had a number of guard posts at different corners. These guard posts were elevated and were about 12 feet off the ground, and would have a Vietnamese Special Forces soldier up in each of those. And then our U.S. Troops, Special Forces, and our unit would have one person on guard duty at all times. And basically our job was to go around, make sure that everything looked safe. And if they were asleep, wake up the Vietnamese guards. And you do that for 2 hours. I know one day I looked at the Special Forces sergeant in charge of the NCOIC, and I said, "Sarge, it says in the Geneva Convention I'm a non-combatant. I can't pull guard duty." And he kind of grinned. He said, "Well, that's true." He said, "When are you supposed to pull guard duty?" I said, 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, "Well, just sleep in." He said, "Of course, we won't have anybody on guard duty, but just sleep in." And so I pulled guard duty.
Every night? It was
no,
every night?
No, it wasn't every night.
But that's yeah. Was it when you were over there? Did you have much communication back with family and friends in the States?
We could get mail to the States quicker than you can get mail from the Billings Gazette to the office across the street. I would develop pictures, or I would make pictures, send the film to Kodak, and 3 days later I'd have all my slides back. The U.S. makes it a point to do everything that they possibly can to make sure that morale among the troops is as good as it can be. And one of those things was mail service. So, I had good contact that way. Now, calling back was just not possible, except on 2 occasions I was able to go to the USO center in Saigon and make a 5-minute call. And that was in a year. But, I put in my book the importance that was given to defeating the troops. And the infantry unit of 1st Infantry Division got a lot of food, and they got really good things supplied. They'd get shrimp and steaks and things like that. But the food that they got was sufficient for every member of the unit. Well, since they had people out on patrol all the time, that would be out for several days eating sea rations, there was always more than they could use. And they weren't allowed to give it to the Vietnamese because of the fact that it might end up in the hands of the enemy. So the requirement was that they'd have to take a bulldozer, dig a pit, pour diesel fuel over the food and then bury it, or they could give it to our little Special Forces camp. And the Special Forces camps, like ours, did not get military rations delivered to us. We were supposed to purchase them and get them to the camp however we could, either go into Saigon or go out onto the economy and buy food. Well, Special Forces camps aren't very big, and 1st Infantry Division Brigade is big, and so they were anxious to give us more food than we could possibly handle. And, we had shrimp and steaks. And
so you were well fed.
we were well fed.
And gourmet sometimes too.
And some of the best gourmet meals that you can ever have.
Was there kind of an irony? Here you are in this remote, very primitive world, and you're having steak and shrimp. Was that a little incongruous?
I think so.
Yeah. What about, let's talk about, was it hard? On one hand, you're a doctor, so you have to, I imagine, accept that your success rate with any patient, with any group of patients, isn't always going to be 100. But because of the primitive conditions, was that ever frustrating to you, or was it hard to lose patients? I mean, I'm assuming it happened. Maybe it didn't. I shouldn't.
Of course it happens.
Yeah.
Just like right here in Montana, I don't know whether you've thought about it, but if you look up the statistics, the death rate in Montana is 100%.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
And you lose patients.
Sure.
And we lost some patients that we might not have lost if we'd had better facilities. We came under our town came under attack one night. The VC would oftentimes attack the civilians because of the fact that they were supposedly cooperating with the American troops and the Vietnamese government troops. And so one night, the entire town was hit by mortars constantly, all night long. And the VC were very careful to make sure that none of the mortar rounds landed in the province chief's compound, none in our camp, and none in the Vietnamese Special Forces camp. They only were targeting civilians. And by morning, at daylight, the firing stopped. It was so foggy that you could probably not see much more than 10 feet ahead, which meant that if there were wounded people, we weren't going to be able to get helicopters in to get anybody out. And we were going to have to take care of whatever there was to take care of. And I don't have a number. I know it was more than 100 casualties that we received. And Dr. Jones, who I've mentioned, served as triage officer. And he triaged patients a little differently than you might in other circumstances. He triaged them based on the people that we had to take care of them. So people who needed very minor things were triaged to be taken care of by the Vietnamese rural health workers that we were training. And that included suturing some lacerations and things like that.
Sure.
Those that required something more intense were cared for by our corpsmen. Those that were going to require surgery of, any significant proportion would be cared for by Dr. Gartland or me in the operating room. And then those that we couldn't help, we just couldn't help. Mm-hmm. And that included a number of head injuries and things like that.
Right.
So we put in a number of chest tubes, admitted a lot of folks to the hospital, did some amputations and things like that. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the fog finally lifted and we could get in helicopters, and we were able to fly some of those that we had not been able to care for. We were able to fly those into Saigon to the Vietnamese big hospital there called Cho Lan. And I'm sure some of them went to the German hospital ship that was in Saigon's harbor, and that ship was called the Helgoland.
What did it? That gives you a different perspective too. You know, we've talked oftentimes when we've talked about either the Viet Cong, the enemy, the NVA. We talked about them firing, and you know, when they're firing or when they're mortaring or rocketing, it's other soldiers. You know, I mean, it's American troops, and the American troops, most of them, you know, freely admit that we were there. We were there as a fighting force, so we understood why we were targets. It must have been hard to see, for you as a doctor, to see basically the Viet Cong or the enemy force hit civilians. That would have been very disturbing.
It was, and yet we knew that it happened all the time. We heard stories about the fact that sometimes when we would go into a village in what we called a med cap and go in and take care of the villagers, and the special forces loved for us to do that because it gave them an opportunity to go in and look around and gather intelligence. But we heard stories that sometimes after we left, that the Viet Cong would come into the village and gather up some of the village leaders and execute them in front of everybody.
That this is what happens with people who conspire, conspirators. What is the most common? You know, it raises the question. Now you're there, kind of general medicine. What are the most kind of common surgeries? Because you don't think of surgeries in that neck of the woods. I guess I can imagine malaria. I can imagine parasites. But tell me about surgery with cows or without them.
Well, of course, there were cesarean sections that
Sure.
we did for complicated deliveries. Most of the other operations were removing something.
Okay.
For instance, John Gartland had a man that came in one day that had a large fatty tumor, a lipoma, that was the size of a grapefruit, and it was on a fellow's side, and the man made his living by being a barber. So John operated on him, took it off, and 2 weeks later, he was supposed to come back to get the sutures removed. Well, 2 weeks later, he came back, and he brought a friend that had a big lipoma, the size of a grapefruit, on his right side.
Wow.
So there were things like that. I removed some ovarian tumors. One of them weighed 28 pounds, so it was a pretty good-sized tumor. That woman came in saying that she'd been pregnant for 2 years, and she looked like it.
But you knew something else was going on.
Well, I knew what was going on. So,
what was it? Did they accept the help that you gave? I mean, was there any fear of when they came in? Did they accept your help? I mean, here you were foreign doctors.
Oh, they were very accepting and very appreciative. John Gartland actually spent, once we were equipped to operate on people, I guess he spent about half his time doing kitty hernias. And, yeah, you know, it was amazing how many kids were out there with hernias. And
did you enjoy surgery? I mean, I know that not all doctors. It's probably probably wrong for me to think that all doctors enjoy surgery. Was it something that you liked or didn't like?
Yeah, it's something that I could do yeah, truthfully, medicine is a calling.
Mm-hmm.
You really don't go into it because of money. Yes, doctors make a good living. But an example of that was I was in Sweden, and it's a socialized medicine situation. And a truck driver makes far more than a physician. The question being, would you rather spend your days in a nice, warm hospital taking care of people, or would you rather be out in the bitter cold driving a truck?
Right.
And so even though they don't get paid that well, having a 4.0 average in Sweden won't get you into medical school. You've got to have a lot of other things going for you before they'll even consider you. So it's very competitive, and it's a calling. And so you're doing what you're best suited to do, and there's a lot of personal reward.
Right. Would you classify your time in Vietnam as a good thing? Was it a good thing for you personally in your life?
Oh, I think it was.
Yeah. What do you, when you came back to practice stateside, in what ways do you think your experience in Vietnam shaped how you practice medicine from that point forward?
Well, I of course came back with far more experience. In my book, I talk about these nurse midwives and the fact that they taught me how to use a vacuum extractor. And at that time, we knew about vacuum extractors, and when I started my residency, I was the only one that had ever used one, and so I taught other people how to use them. You always benefit from any experience you have, and I think it has served me well, because that's not the only place that I've been in my lifetime where I've had to use what there was, and if what I needed didn't exist, then figure out another way.
Can you tell me the story about, I was just as you were talking, was reminded of, you didn't have some of the equipment, you didn't also have electricity, so how would you do serological tests? Tell me about how you, because that requires some equipment that you didn't have.
Well, we didn't do much in the way of serological tests, but a lot of blood tests and things like that. For instance, one of the more common things was to get a hematocrit, which is you take a tube of blood and you spin it down and you see what percentage is red blood cells, and that's the hematocrit. Well, that requires a centrifuge. We didn't have a centrifuge, but our medics could make anything do something else. And so the one that ran the lab would take a tube and with blood in it, and had a string attached to it, and he'd spin it around his head for about 2 minutes and then look at it and get the percentage. Now, another very common thing that you would do would be a differential, where you use a microscope and you make a smear and you look at the white blood cells and determine how many of the cells are lymphocytes and how many are different types of white blood cells. Well, we had a microscope, but we didn't have any electricity for a light. So what do? You take the mirror on the microscope and you point it at the north sky where there's no sun, and you use the light from the sky. And of course, on a dark day, it was a little bit of a problem.
Right.
And you couldn't do it at night. So these were tests that could only be done during the day. And you want to count the number of different cells and get a percentage. So you want to count 100 white blood cells. Well, what he did was he had a little glass dish called a Petri dish, and he had 100 rocks in it. And then he had a sheet of paper with the different types of white blood cells. Then if it was a lymphocyte, he'd take a rock and put it on the block marked lymphocytes. And if it was a band, he'd take a rock and put it on that. And when all the rocks were used up, he'd count them up, and that was...
This is, it works.
It works.
Yeah, yeah. What's your favorite memory from Vietnam?
I think my favorite memory of all of them was the time I was invited by the nurses to come to a dinner that they had, that they fixed, and they served just a lot of different Vietnamese foods, and it was just a great dinner.
Right. When you were working with the Vietnamese patients, is there any difference? Are our patients? Was there any difference between how you had to practice medicine Vietnamese versus Americans?
Well, surgery on Vietnamese was much easier than surgery in the United States.
Why?
Because Vietnamese were all thin. And to go into the abdomen of a patient that had skin and then muscle and no fat, and you could get down to the appendix or whatever you were going after, was just so easy. And if you come back to the States and you've got somebody that's 5'2" and weighs 450 pounds, getting down
to the appendix is rough.
Or to the uterus or whatever is just extremely difficult. So it was much easier, believe it or not, to do surgery in Vietnam. And in fact, when I came back and started my residency, it was a bit of a shock to me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
that and probably thinking that everybody else was spoiled here. I mean,
yeah.
This electricity thing and lights.
Yeah.
So tell me, let's walk you through when you left Vietnam. What was leaving Vietnam like?
Well, it was a difficult moment in some ways.
Okay, why?
Shortly before I left, we were told that General Abrams, the man that the Abrams tank is named after, was going to be coming to our camp. And probably about 8:30 in the morning, helicopter landed, and General Abrams and 3 or 4 other generals that were with him got off. And we knew something was up, but we went to the hospital and did what we did. And General Abrams and his men stayed for lunch, and then they left. Well, that evening, Major Mendoza, our camp commander, gathered us all in the mess hall and told us that the message was that our camp of 30 people was surrounded by 40,000 North Vietnamese regulars who were obviously planning to do something. And this was right before the Big Tet Offensive. And we'd been promised all the help that they could give us if we came under attack. But the truth was, 30 men surrounded by
40,000
40,000
those are terrible odds.
Troops was not good odds. And had suggested that we sleep in flak jackets, have our helmets, and sleep in the bunkers, the defensive bunkers that, and so for 2 weeks that's what I did, and then it was my time to leave, and as the plane was taking off and circling to gain altitude, and I was looking down at the camp and the hospital and thinking about all of those people, I knew that it was going to get bad, and that there would probably be people who were friends that were going to die.
Yeah.
And,
tough.
And yes, it was good to be able to go back home, but it was, on the other hand, it was tough leaving.
Yeah. Did you ever hear what happened?
The attack did come. One of the camps that I went to frequently, Lot Ninh was attacked, and there were over 3,000 North Vietnamese killed at that camp during that attack, and one of our medical team was killed. All of the Special Forces camps that I had been going to came under attack the same day. The town came under attack, and there was a bitter battle that went on for a week or more, and I don't know how many of the people were killed.
Let's talk about, so when you got back to the States, what was it like, and how was reintegration?
Well, the first thing was that doorknobs were round. and the second thing was, it was just the most amazing thing in the world to go into a grocery store or a department store, because I hadn't seen anything like that for a year.
Right.
And, and there were people who were very nice to me. I made one mistake not long before I left. While I was there, there was an occasion that the camp's ice maker broke down. Now, we had a well, and we chlorinated the water, or at least Special Forces did. And they went to get ice in the town, not realizing that the ice could carry viruses and things like that. And about half of the people in our camp came down with hepatitis.
Oh.
And I had a mild case, but not severe enough that I quit working. Dr. Gartland and Lieutenant Porter and a number of our corpsmen were all shipped to Japan to recover from their hepatitis, and I kept working. And when they started coming back, I took some R&R and went to Bangkok. Well, in Bangkok, Thailand, they have the best tailors maybe in the world. And so I got 2 suits and a sports coat and a dinner jacket made up, and they were just fantastic. And I loved my weight. I had lost 30 pounds. Well, I got back to the States, and in 2 weeks, I couldn't put those on anymore.
So you're glad to, so what I take from that is you were glad to be back home.
I was glad to be back home. Everybody invited me to come for meals.
And you took them up on
them, and then I couldn't wear any of the clothes that I had made up.
Did people treat you differently, or did they acknowledge your time in Vietnam?
They did. I don't think anyone treated me particularly differently. I knew when I got back that there was a lot of hostility directed at the troops. Mm-hmm. and I was asked one time if I'd ever killed anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I hadn't.
Right.
I've been shot at, but
Right. Well, and you were a doctor, but so the whole goal was not to. I mean, I suppose.
no.
Yeah.
So.
Well, did looking back on it, is Vietnam something that you've obviously wrote about in your book? So it's nothing you've necessarily run from or necessarily put on the back shelf, but does it come up often in conversation?
Not very often.
Okay.
Every now and then people will ask me about it, and the reason I wrote my book was that I had a friend, and I'll just mention his name, Ron Bailey, in Laurel, who kept harassing me for 2.5 years, telling me that I had a story that needed to be written. And finally he told me that he was going to say it one last time, but that I owed it to my children and grandchildren to write it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did, and planned to, print off about 6 copies and have them for my 6 kids, and that was going to be it. Maybe one extra copy, to keep at home.
Mm-hmm.
And never thought it'd be published.
Sure.
Well, it ended up being published.
Yeah. What do your children and grandchildren think about you having been in the war and been a doctor? How does that play?
I don't think they think about it.
Okay, well, fair enough. Fair enough.
I think they've all got enough going on in their lives that
Yeah. Well, looking back, it's been 50 years.
Yeah.
This is I'm a journalist because I don't do math, so thank you for keeping the numbers with 65, 66 nice and round for me. Looking back 50 years, has your view of Vietnam changed, or how do you look at it now with the passage of time?
I look at it truthfully with regret, because I don't think that war had to happen.
Yeah.
And I've told you why.
Yep.
I think, when the French tried to move back in and Ho Chi Minh and his people ran them out, that we should have left it at that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that a unified Vietnam at that time would have been our ally. We probably would have had a naval base, maybe 2, and we would probably have Mr. Trump building hotels and resorts.
There.
And
maybe that would have so many ways it might have been better, right?
Yeah.
Let's are there certain sights, smells, sounds, sensory trips memory? Are there certain things that that you'll hear, see, smell, whatever, and it will take you back to Vietnam? Are there things that you associate specifically with it?
If I'm in a place where the air is really polluted,
mm-hmm.
then I'll think about Saigon with all the little motor scooters and things running around, and it was a very polluted place. Or if I'm in a place that's really noisy and busy, I'll think of Saigon. When I smell Oriental food, I'll frequently think about that.
Yeah. Looking at one of the reasons we're doing this, and I think I want folks who want to understand Vietnam or understand that war to be able to hear about it from people who were over there and experienced it. And I've asked a lot of veterans this question. I'll ask that of you too. What do you hope that in the future, when maybe your great-grandchildren or even generations ahead want to know what Vietnam was like? What do you hope they remember?
What I hope that they remember is that it's the same thing that General Colin Powell emphasized, and that is never go to war unless you intend to win. Mm-hmm. And from what I could tell, we never intended to win, but we lost thousands of people, some of whom were friends of mine.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you don't go to war, but if you go to war, you go with everything you've got, and you go to win.
Yep.
You know, to wear a T-shirt that says Vietnam War Games, second place.
Yeah.
That's not the T-shirt I really wanted to have to wear.
Right. You didn't want to play. I think, that echoes the sentiment of most. Not of most. I can't think of someone who said, well, I was just happy with the outcome, because I don't think if there's been a consistent theme throughout it's been what you've just said. What else have I missed about your Vietnam experience that I haven't covered, or what else haven't we touched upon?
I don't know what it would be, except just to talk about the fact that the people that I dealt with in Vietnam were people with the same desires that we have. I can't tell you in strong enough terms how wonderful the Vietnamese hospital staff was.
No, that's a good point. That people, this war of machines and guns and all of that undermines the fact that people are people.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point. I can't think of a better way to say that. Well, I want to tell you two things. I want to say thank you for going over there and serving, and thank you for I can't imagine a better face of America than someone who goes over there to try to help people when they need it the most. And that's a great story. And thank you for being, the second thing is not only thank you for serving, thank you for being a part of this series and telling your story, because I think it's what a great aspect and an element you've brought. So I want to thank you for both of those things.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance.
Well, it's been I've been in this business for 20 years, and this has been the greatest honor for me to interview vets and get their stories and be the other guy. Not on camera, I might add. People have said that I'm just a voice right now for a lot of people, and if you've seen my face or my broken nose, you'll know why, but it's been a great honor to be on the other side of the microphone and the camera listening to your story. So this is Daryl Ehrlich. This has been Vietnam Voices, and I've been with Dr. David Roberts, who was with the U.S. Air Force and on a humanitarian portion of that in Vietnam. It has been my honor to hear his story, and I thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good day.